Hey everybody, welcome to reading on this Tuesday. We're getting near the end, guys. We got Wednesday, Thursday after today, and Friday is going to be a real simple, easy day. Just a heads up, our final vocab test will be one of the only things you have to do on Friday besides joining together for our end of the year Zoom that we'll wrap things up on, okay? So just a reminder, if the vocab practice test didn't go really well yesterday when you practiced your words, and if it doesn't go really well today, you've got a couple days yet, but I really, really want everybody to do super well on that last vocab test. So if you miss a lot of words, really spend some time today practicing those words so you're ready to go for that final test. That's going to be your last reading grade, and it'll be a major one, right? A test. So I really, really want to see everybody do well on that. So when you practice your vocab words today, if you miss any, really drill them in your head. And if you miss a lot, my recommendation would be practice again. Do another practice test or do a few rounds of matching or try a Quizlet Learn mode for a little while and get those words down so you're good to go for Friday, okay? So just a heads up that that's coming. Lambasting is in the second paragraph on 129. It says, "Then the brothers had to do some trembling and clinging while John finished lambasting them for running away." So what does it mean that when John McNabb found his brothers with Maniac Magee and learned that they had run away, that he lambasted them or did a lot of lambasting of them? Lambasting means yelling at, shouting at, screaming at. So lambasting. Autopsy 132. If you watch like crime TV shows, maybe you hear about this. 132, the second sentence on the very, very top of the page. On the table were what appeared to be the remains of an autopsy performed on a large bird, possibly a crow. If you watch crime shows or if you watch shows where the people have died in them, often they'll do an autopsy. An autopsy is when they take someone who has died and they look into their body to try to figure out why they died. You know, if there's a suspicious death and they find someone dead in their home, they want to know, well, did someone kill them or did this person just die normally, right? So often when somebody dies, they'll open them up and look inside them and see, oh, whoops, okay, I see why they died. They had a heart attack or they had blockage in their veins or arteries or something, right? That's called an autopsy. They'll often do that when someone dies just so they know why the person died and they can let the relatives know, or if it was a suspicious death, you know, look for someone who hurt that person if it was a murder or something. And so that's an autopsy. So it said on the table were the remains of an autopsy performed on a large bird, possibly a crow. So these kids at the McNabb house, man, they have like no adult supervision, right? All they seem to have is a dad who really doesn't seem to care what they do and who seems to be gone a lot, probably drinking too much alcohol. And so one of the kids brought in like a dead bird and began to cut it open right on their table. Ugh, gross, nasty, but that's the way their house is. Can you imagine living in a house like that? We talked yesterday about the challenges of living in poverty, in an extremely poor home where parents aren't able to be around to help their kids. The dad's probably working all day, right, and then comes home and is probably too tired to look over them or care about them. He doesn't seem to be a very caring guy to begin with. So an autopsy is an examination of a dead person. And again, they're trying to figure out why they died. So is that really what the boys were doing to this bird? No, someone probably just brought it in and was doing like their own little science experiment on it. These are two little boys, right? And so it sounds like something some boys might do, right? Perilous, 142. Let's see, last paragraph. And on that day, they gave him the most perilous challenge of all. They dared him to go to the East End. So this is the part of the book where those two brothers, Piper and Russell, McNabb's little brothers, right, are giving Magee dares. And if Magee does them, Maniac Magee does them, then they promise to stay in school. So he's just doing all these crazy dares. And then they dared him to go to the East End. Remember, they're white kids, right, from the inner part of the white side of town, right? And they think it's a really bad dare for him to go into the black side. Is that something Maniac Magee would find really dangerous, though? No way, right? He's been there. And Maniac Magee knows they're just different colored skin people. They're not anything to be afraid of. And so perilous means dangerous. See, Piper and Russell thought they were giving him a perilous, a dangerous dare, but little did they know Maniac Magee felt perfectly comfortable on that side of the city. So he's like, sure, I'll do that. Oh, that's so dangerous. Oh, boy. And he really played it up, right? But again, he was trying to keep Russell and Piper in school. So what are two of the deals that Russell and Piper made with Maniac Magee so that he could keep them going to school? Maniac Magee wants them to go, so he's willing to do just about anything to convince them to stay, right? He promised that he would, show them a shorter way to Mexico. He promised that he'd give them a pizza if they went another week, right? And so there's all kinds of different things that he's doing to try to convince them to stay in school. What was the real reason Russell and Piper put up with school? How did they feel for the first time ever? So remember, these kids are like ignored. The fancy word for that is neglected, child neglect. That is a form of child abuse. If parents don't care for their kids, that's called child neglect. Their dad could actually get in trouble for that. If you don't take care of your children, you can get in trouble with child protective services and the police and stuff, right? And so what was the real reason Russell and Piper were going to school? Because Maniac was giving them attention. No one ever in their life, it seems, has given them much attention. And here's this cool guy that there's legends about that's actually paying attention to them. So for the first time ever, they felt like they mattered, right? And so that was what really was keeping them in school. Someone was caring about them. And that's kind of a touching part of the story. Maniac was showing them care. They had never really been shown care and attention before. Number 3, what did they dare Maniac to do in exchange for another week of school? How did Maniac expand the dare to make it 2 weeks? So they wanted him to go into Mr. Finsterwald's backyard. Remember, that's the scary guy that we've seen before in the book that no one even likes to go in his yard, right? And of course, Maniac doesn't care. He goes and sits in there for 10 minutes. And then he's like, oh, I'll tell you what, how about for 2 weeks I knock on his door? And so, of course, the two kids, Russell and Piper, oh, yeah, that would be horrible, right? And so he goes and does that. And describe in 2 sentences how the reaction of the kids was when Maniac did that. So he did knock on the door, and Mr. Finsterwald answered, and Maniac even talked to him for a little bit, and then just walked away. He was perfectly fine. And the kids thought he was a ghost or something. How could he possibly survive knocking on Mr. Finsterwald's door, right? And so Maniac proved something false that was a stereotype about Mr. Finsterwald false, right? Everyone in the whole town, it seems, thinks Mr. Finsterwald is an evil, awful guy. Maniac just proved that wrong. He turned out to be a perfectly fine guy that he was even able to talk to at the door. And the kids wanted him to eat the butterscotch crimpets to prove that he wasn't a ghost. Kind of crazy, right? Number 7, what were 2 more challenges Maniac did to keep the kids in school? So in chapter 37, he had to hit a pole with a stone 61 times in a row, and supposedly he did that. Now, again, this is a legend, so the story of Maniac Magee is probably stretched. It'd be pretty hard to hit a pole 61 times in a row. And he had to take off his sneakers and socks and walk through the rat-infested dump. It's like a garbage dump, and he did that too. Maniac Magee doesn't seem to be afraid of any of this stuff, right? Number 6, what did Maniac understand about everything that he was doing? Why did he do all this? And so he realized that, these were the only things that were keeping Russell and Piper in school. And it was boosting their importance in the eyes of other kids. And, he realized that if he stopped doing these things, these kids' lives would fall apart because they'd stop going to school. So he just kept doing this out of love and concern for them, right? And so once again, we see Maniac being such a caring character in our book, and that's really, really cool. Number 7, what new challenge did the boys give Maniac at the end of the chapter? They dared him to go into the East End, right? We talked about that with the word perilous. They thought, oh, this is going to be a dangerous dare, but little do they know, Maniac Magee has been on the East End, on the black side of the city many times, and he's perfectly fine with that. So Maniac's happy to take that dare, even though the boys think it's extra dangerous. Maniac Magee got me thinking about a passage from the Bible. John 13, verse 35 says this, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Jesus tells us how people will recognize us as being Christian. And one of the strongest ways that people will recognize us as being God's children, as Christians, he says, is if you love one another. People will know that you're God's disciples. And think about that. I know Maniac Magee isn't a Christian book. It doesn't really say much about God or God's word or anything. But notice Maniac Magee and just the way that he shows love for all people. It's just a really cool thing, right? He loves and shows love even to his enemies, John McNabb's his brothers, right? What a cool thing that, he could have treated them like trash because John McNabb treated him like trash, but he didn't. He treated them with love and respect. Think about how he treats the Beals, right? Even though they had different skin color than him, he was very respectful towards them and shook Mrs. Beals' hand when he first met her. Think about how he treated Grayson, an old man who no one else seemed to pay any attention to. Maniac Magee was loving and kind towards him. And that's the way God wants us as Christians to look to the world. And so a good question for you to ask yourself is that the way that other people see me? Does the love of Jesus reflect in my life in the way that I treat my family at home? You get a lot of chances to practice that right now, right? Because we're stuck at home with all our brothers and sisters and moms and dads every day, right? Is the way that you treat them and speak to them in these days show the love of Jesus? Hopefully it does. We all have to admit, not always, right? We sin and we forget to do that sometimes. But the love of Jesus motivates us to live differently, right? So how can you let that change today in the way you treat your family? How about your classmates at school? Even when you're out playing football with them on the field, right, or basketball, and maybe things don't go your way or a call doesn't go your way, does your love for them shine through? The love for Jesus that you have show for them in the way that you patiently deal with them, in the way that you say kind things to them, or out on the playground, the way you avoid gossip and show love even for the people that aren't maybe among you, that you say kind things about them or refuse to take part in gossip that could be bad or hurt their reputation, right? What are the ways that in your life the love of Jesus shows for others? Because God tells us that's the way people know that we're his disciples, and that's what makes you stand out in this world as so different. Do you see how Maniac Magee in this book looks so different than all the other characters, right? He's the one person that seems to be remembering to love all people, no matter what their skin color. And that looks different. And people begin to notice that. Even John McNabb is noticing that and beginning to treat Maniac with more respect because he took care of his brothers, right? And when in our world, too, when you show love to people, even the people who aren't kind to you, that looks different. And people say, I wonder what makes that person different. And then that gives you opportunities to tell them why you act differently than the rest of the world, why you love even those difficult-to-love people, because you have a Savior, Jesus, who loved you first. And that's my picture of the cross there, right? And you can tell people about that. So that's my encouragement to you. I know Maniac Magee is not a Christian book, but when I read this book, I can't help but think of how much love Maniac Magee is so careful to show to all the people he meets. And I know it's just a made-up story, but that's the way God wants you to be viewed as a Christian, as his child, that you love other people just like Jesus loved you. And that looks really different in this world. People will notice that because you don't often find that in our world today because it's so filled with sin. And so when you live that way, people notice and they pick up on that. And they wonder why that is. And there's your chance then to share the gospel with them, right? So that's my code word for you today. Our code word is Jesus, because I want you to let the love of Jesus shine in your life in the way that you treat all people, your family at home, your friends at school, and everyone you meet. Let the love of Jesus shine through, and that will look different. People will know that you're God's disciples because of that. All right, let's read the next section together and then get you going to your assignment today. Page 143, chapter 38. We're almost done with the book, which is why our test is coming up on Friday. So keep practicing those vocab words. Here we go. The witnesses, there were twice 15 this time, so in other words 30, went with him as far as Hector Street. So here he is doing the dare to go to the east end of town, right, which wasn't dangerous to him at all. He crossed the street and went alone. Piper megaphoned after him like he put his hands around his mouth and shouted, right, "Maniac, come back! We was just kidding. You don't have to." Maniac just waved and went on. He knew he should be feeling afraid of these East Enders, these so-called black people, but he wasn't. It was himself he was afraid of any trouble he might cause just by being there. Remember last time he was there, people were unkind to him. He doesn't want to cause any more trouble, right? It was the day of the worms, the first almost warm after the rainy night day in April, when you bolt from your house to find yourself in a world of worms. You ever had that happen? You go outside when it's warmer after a rain, and all the worms are like on the sidewalk on the road, right? You know why they do that, right? Because otherwise they could drown if they stayed in their holes in the ground that are filled with water, right? So worms will head out of the ground when it rains a lot. Okay. They were as numerous here in the East End as they had been in the West. The sidewalks, the streets, the very places where they didn't belong. Forlorn, marooned on concrete and asphalt, no place to burrow. April's orphans. So notice there's a metaphor there. He calls the worms orphans. Now, they really aren't orphans, but that's a good comparison from them. They are where they don't belong, right? I think Maniac can relate to these worms, feeling like he doesn't belong, right? Once when he was little in Hollidaysburg, top of 144, he had gone along with his toy wheelbarrow, carefully lifting them with a borrowed kitchen fork until the barrow was full, then dumped them into Mr. Snavely's compost pile. Compost piles are like piles of disintegrating old food and stuff, right? And sure as the worms followed the rain, the kids followed the worms. West End, East End, they had poured from their houses onto the cool, damp sidewalks, and if they gave the worms any notice, it was only when they squashed one underfoot. And so, as Maniac moved through the East End, he felt the presence of not one, but two populations, both occupying the same territory, yet each unmindful of each other, one yelping and playing and chasing and laughing, the other lost and silent, dying by the millions. So how are worms like this town, right? Do you see how this comparison is being made to this town? That both groups of people really kind of just ignore each other except to hurt one another. Just like the kids in this town, Maniac is noticing, the kids just keep right on playing on the sidewalks and the streets, and they end up hurting and wrecking the the worms because they step on them and squash them, right? Otherwise, they don't even notice each other. Isn't that a good comparison for this town of 2 mills? The black people and white people kind of go on their lives and just ignore each other, and the only times they do notice each other is when they try to hurt each other or say nasty things about each other. Isn't that a cool comparison that Jerry Spinelli makes here between the worms in this town of 2 mills? Anyways, middle of page 144. Yo, fish belly! Uh-oh. Maniac snapped to. He glanced at a street sign. He was 4 blocks from Hector, deep in the east. Mars Bar came dip-jiving toward him, taller than before, bigger but still scowling. Hey, fish! Thought you was gone. Maniac turned to face him fully. Mars Bar did not stop till he was inside Maniac's phone booth of space, inches from his face. They locked eyes levelly. Maniac thinking, I must be growing too. So in other words, Maniac realized he's like the same height as Mars Bar now. He said, I'm back. The scowl fiercened. Maybe nobody told you. I'm badder than ever. I'm getting badder every day. I'm almost afraid to wake up in the morning. He leaned in closer, 'cause how bad I might have gotten overnight. Maniac smiled and nodded. Yeah, you're bad, Mars. Top of 145. He gave a sniff. His smile went a little smirky, so Maniac just kind of smiles at him, right? And I'm getting so bad myself, I think I must be half black. We'll see what Mars Bar thinks of that. Mars' eyes bulged. He backed off. The scowl collapsed, and he howled with laughter, so he thought it was funny, right? His buddies, who were hanging back, stared dumbly. As Mars unwound from his laughing fit, he studied Maniac up and down, aware, too, that Maniac was studying him. When he could speak again, he said, Still them raggedy clothes, huh, fish? He lifted one foot, posed. I seen you looking. Like them kicks? Just got 'em. Some Mars Bar got some new shoes, right? Maniac nodded. Nice. They were more than nice. They were beautiful. The best, yes, the baddest sneaks he had ever seen. Way better than anything Grayson could have afforded. I forgot to tell you something else, too, fish. What's that? I'm fast. I'm faster. I've been working out. Got my new boss kicks. He sprinted in place, arms and legs pistoning to a blur. He stopped. He jabbed a finger at Maniac's nose, pressed it, flattening the soft end of it. See? Guess you were right. Now at least you got a black nose. He laughed. They both laughed. Everybody laughed. Then Mars turned scowly again, saying, But you ain't black enough or bad enough to beat the Mars man. We gonna race, honky donkey. So notice, Maniac treats Mars Bar with respect, stands up to him, right? He's respectful, but he stands up to him. And notice, Mars Bar actually treats him somewhat kindly, right? Maybe a lesson for us, right, about how to treat even the people that aren't so kind to us. Bottom of 145. So he gets challenged to a race. Look what happens. The race was set up on Plum Street, the long level block between Ash and Jackson. By the time they were ready, half the kids in the East End were there. So all these kids, these black kids, come out to watch them race, right? Top of 146. From the tiniest pipsqueaks to high schoolers, the little kids ran races of their own from curb to curb. The bigger kids shouldered blasters and dug into their jeans for coins to bet with. For the first time since last fall, mothers opened windows and leaned out from second stories. Traffic was detoured from both ends of the block. No one could find string for the finish, so a second-story mother dropped down a spool of bright pink thread. Another problem was the start. First, they had to find chalk to draw the starting line. When they did, nobody could seem to draw it straight. The result, a stack of starting lines creeping up the street till someone brought out a yardstick and did it right. The next problem came when the starter, Bump Gilliam, who was also Mars Bar's best pal, called, Get ready, and someone in the crowd yelled, That ain't what you say. You say, take your mark. Well, everybody jumped into it then. There was shoving and jawing and almost a fist fight over the proper way to start a race. Kind of funny, right? Finally, there was a compromise, and Bump called, Get ready, on your mark, at which point someone else called, Go, Mars! And Bump turned and snarled, Shut up! When the starter starts, there's no noise. So naturally, someone else called, Smoke 'em, Mars! And then came, Waste 'em, Mars! And do the honk, barman! And they might still be calling to this day, had not a single voice separated itself from the others. Burn 'em, Magee! It was hands down, laughing and pointing from his perch on the roof of a car. So notice his buddy showed up. Bump jumped into the let-up. Get set, go! Top of 147. And at long last, mossy from their weight at the starting line. Notice it's an exaggeration that's kind of funny. Supposedly they stood there so long that moss grew on them. Obviously it's an exaggeration, a hyperbole, right? An extreme exaggeration. Mossy from their weight at the starting line, they went. Second paragraph on 147. Even as the race began, even after it began, Maniac wasn't sure how to run it. Naturally, he wanted to win, or at least do his best. All his instincts told him that. But there were other considerations, whom he was racing against and where, and what the consequences might be if he won. So while Maniac's running, he's like, okay, do I actually want to win this race? He's on the black end of town, where most of the people are cheering for Mars Bar, right? And he's like, if I win, are they going to like beat me up or something? Or, he's trying to think this through, like, okay, what should I do, right? Should I run hard or not? These were heavy considerations, heavy enough to slow him down until the hysterical crowd and the sight of Mars Bar's sneaker bottoms at the boiling of his own blood ignited his afterburners, and before you could say, "Burn him, Magee," he was ahead, the pink thread bobbing in his sights. But he never saw his body break the thread. He saw only the face of Mars Bar, straining, gasping, unbelieving, losing. So he ended up beating him, right? They went crazy. They went wild. They went totally bananas. You see him? He turned around. He ran backwards. He did it backwards. He beat him going backwards. So at the end, Maniac turned around and looked at Mars Bar as he finished, right? Mars Bar tried. He shoved Bump. You started too fast. I wasn't ready. He shoved the thread holders. You moved it up so he could win. I was gaining on him. He shoved Maniac. You bumped me. You got a false start. You cheated. But his protest drowned out in the pandemonium. So Mars Bar is trying to come up with excuses, right? But it just gets drowned out by all the cheering. Why did I do it? Was all Maniac could think. He hadn't even realized it till he crossed the line, and he regretted it instantly. Wasn't it enough just to win? So Maniac Magee feels bad that he kind of showboated, that he turned around and even ran backwards. And he's wondering why he did that. Top of 148. Did he have to disgrace his opponent as well? He had done it. Had he done it deliberately to pay back Mars Bar for all his nastiness? To show him up and shut him up once and for all? His only recollection was a feeling of sheer joyful exuberance, himself in celebration, shouting "Amen" in the Bethany church, bashing John McNabb's fastballs out of sight, dancing the polka with Grayson. Maybe it was that simple. After all, who asks why otters toboggan down the mud banks? But that didn't make it any less stupid or a rotten thing to do. The hatred in Mars Bar's eyes was no longer for a white kid in the East End. It was for Jeffrey Magee, period. So notice Magee, I know we've been talking about how kind he's been to other people. Maniac Magee is not a perfect person either, even in this book. He realizes what he did was wrong, and he feels bad about that, right, for showing off. Okay? The crowd surged with him as he made his way westward. It wasn't clear whether they were glad or not that he had won, only that they had seen something to set them off. They jostled and jammed and high-fived and jibed. For every one who called him White Lightning, two more challenged him to a race. Right here, baby, you and me. See who's going to turn his back on who. Maniac kept moving, embarrassed, wishing he could just break out and sprint for the West End, wishing he could just duck into the Beals' house and be sanctuaried, which is one of our vocab words, by the way, there and not fear reprisals on them. And just about then, miraculously, two little hands were worming into his, two familiar voices squealing, "Maniac! Maniac!" Hester and Lester, so they showed up, right? He snatched them up, one in each arm. He was on Sycamore Street. There was the house, the door opening, Amanda, Mrs. Beals smiling, to the beat of the band. So as he's thinking about, boy, I really shouldn't have done that, and wondering if he should get out of the city, all of a sudden Hester and Lester show up, and he's right by the Beals' house, right? And so we'll see what happens at that point. We'll see what Maniac does. He really probably showboated and seemingly seemed to hurt Mars Bar's feelings, right? And Maniac's wondering if that was a really bad thing for him to do. We'll see how that turns out, and maybe if Maniac apologizes or decides he doesn't need to, we'll see. But there would be probably the first time in the book that we've seen Maniac act in a way that maybe wasn't the kindest towards someone else. And you can see how it bothered him. It bothered his conscience, that voice inside him that God's given all of us, right? That bugs us when we do the wrong thing, when God's upset with us. God gave us a conscience to let us know when we're sinning, right? So we'll see what Maniac Magee does as his conscience bothers him about showing off a little bit when he won the race over Mars Bar. All right, enjoy the next section. I think the book's getting hopefully pretty interesting to you as we get close to the end, and you'll see how this story ends. Have a good day, guys.